Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to wrap up the week with an album reaction where we check out a full album, going track by track, exploring each song in isolation and their part of the larger whole. Today we're looking at the French-Canadian group Gris, which I know I've already mispronounced the band name, and the album title and track titles are all in French too. So I'm just going to call them track 1 through 6, and we're checking out this album because I've listened to the pronunciations of some of these titles and it's French, dude. I can't, my mouth isn't built for French. I don't know. So let's dive into this. We have 6 tracks. Just under 60 minutes, averaging about 10 minutes a piece, which is fairly accurate. This isn't one of those cases where the French has thrown me off. I pushed the wrong button. All right. There we go. That's better. This is on Bandcamp, can't find it on Spotify, so we do have this janky little way of presenting the time down here. Probably be a bit small, but I think it gets the job done. Anyways, as I was saying, there isn't any 30-minute song where there needs to be a bunch of 4 or 5-minute tracks to offset that. Pretty much all 6 of these tracks are sitting around the 10-minute range. So let's dive into this track 1. Oh, we have had them on the channel before. I do know that they are black metal. That's about all I know about this. Incredibly fuzzy guitars, the pained ESBM scream style. Yeah, I mean, look at the volume. Not that one. That way. All the way over there. I mean, that thing's just locked at full. There's so much compression on this. The drums are clipping on the outsides. We have the haunting strings back there. Interesting rhythmic shift there, a little bit of a time feel difference. Fading out on this side to come in on this side, like some sort of like sunset into a sunrise. I like that little bit of fancier cymbal work. I'd like to see more of that. In fact, I think I've praised this group's drum work in the past, haven't I? There's some temporal looseness, both in this section and a previous one, though, that I think is really interesting. Little guitar thing over here. So like this feels like an accelerando, but then we'll return back to the original tempo. That's the third time I felt something like that. Interesting because this guitar over here sounds like it's more melodic, but it's still just following the chord progression. That cymbal works nice though. For better or worse, this is what I expected. It's black metal, pretty clearly. The guitars are incredibly fuzzy. A lot of the time, the guitar work is rhythmically static, focusing on emotional atmosphere coming through the timbre of the instruments, the incredible size and buzziness of them, mixed with the emotive harmonic ideas, the chord progressions themselves. And this song does a fantastic job of leaning into that. Every moment of this track feels depressive. It feels sorrowful. It feels heavy. A lot of this does come from the chordal work. The chords in here are sad, pretty straightforward sad, not like there's depth to it, just like we picked a traditional sad series of chords in order to make something that just feels incredibly sad right from the start. You can't miss it. It's not like it's tucked in there. It's not like it's mixed with other emotions. It's just sad, straight up. But there's also the timbres in here as well. There's the violins that showed up twice, I think, particularly there at the end. I think they really gave a little bit of that mournful sound to the track, just increasing that emotional pain in the atmosphere of the song. It's also in the bass lines, though. There are a few moving bass lines in here, and usually once the bass starts to have a little bit of a progression, it leans into more tension and darker ideas. Most of the time, though, it's just pedal tone. We get a lot of that, but it is nice when it deviates from that and it just allows itself to expand on and really pile on more of that emotional weight that the guitars are already expressing. On the topic of size and weight, though, there's also the drums, which just sound massive. When those bass kicks are going 16th notes, it is so big that we have clipping on the outsides of the track, and that just feels insurmountable. It is this incredible size that just feels like it compresses the listener down. For oppressive depression, I think this track nails it. There is, of course, the other part of this track that's kind of difficult to ignore. It's the vocals. This is hit and miss, and I've brought this up in the past too. Do they sound like pained vocals? Yes, absolutely. These are the types of wails and shrieks I would expect to hear of somebody who was not in a comfortable position, whatever that might be. But I have a really big problem buying into it, and I try my best to meet music like this on its own terms. And I will try to avoid returning back to this topic since I've brought it up not just before, even on reactions for this band, but also on other DSBM bands. I don't buy into this very well. It is so extreme that it is difficult for me to accept it at face value, and it pushes into absurdity. It sort of becomes comical. It is so exaggerated that it doesn't feel like it's serious anymore. I understand that probably from the perspective of the vocalist, this is serious art. They want this pained yelling to work with the atmosphere and to create this incredibly oppressive feeling, to allow the pain of the atmosphere and the chord progressions to match the pain in the vocals. And I from an artistic perspective, I see it 100%. From a subjective perspective, though, it's comical to me. It is too over the top. And I have a really tough time enjoying this the way that I think it's intended to be enjoyed. All right. I think I've said my piece on that. Like I said, I've brought it up before, so... All right, moving on. There's not a lot of melody in this song. It is almost purely atmospheric. And it goes through a couple of different atmospheres. I can feel some back and forth on this. There's some sections that are, I don't know if I would call them a chorus maybe, but it is an idea that we return to after exploring other ideas. I don't know if we're working with like a verse chorus structure, or maybe we just have a chorus, which I typically assign to the letter B in structure. Maybe like an A, B, C, D, B, E, F, B, and like always coming back to this chorus idea, creating that cyclicality and familiarity within something more linear. I don't know. I have a tough time understanding this track because there still is a lot of compression and distortion to this. Is it one of the clearer black metal tracks I've listened to? Yeah, we've heard lower fidelity stuff. And my ears are acclimating to this after 5 years of being subjected to this genre. But there's still so much of it that is, for me, disguised underneath the texture, the distortion, the buzz. And I think it's specific instruments. When I can hear the bass, when the drums change up their ideas, because aside from the bass kick, the snare and cymbal work are pretty clear in here. The snare could be a little less fuzzy, it could have more clarity to it, but the cymbals are crisp. I can always make out what they're doing. And so I can kind of judge structure from the drum work a little bit. I can judge it from when the vocals are there and when they're not. There's a lot of instrumental stuff in here. The violin, as I mentioned, is an instrument I can hear clearly, and it only shows up a couple of times. So there are elements in here that I can use as landmarks to kind of see where we are in the track. But for the most part, I mean, a lot of this is 16th note bass kick, 16th note guitar, 16th note bass guitar, and all of this is generally pretty muddy. Not the muddiest, I'd say somewhere like a mid-5 production style, and there are moments when I can get more clarity out of it. But it is tough for me to grasp all of the details. I feel like I'm really only getting the surface level stuff because everything past that is through a veil. It's a fog, it's distorted to a point that it's tough to make out the small details. I can get, you know what it is? It's like blur, like visual blur, where you can pick out the larger ideas, you can see colors, but it's blurry. You can't actually make out the picture. Like viewing pointillism from up close, you really need to get some distance to view it properly, but I can't get that distance. The song requires me to be up close to it, and all I see are a bunch of dots. I get a general feeling based on colors and stuff, but it's tough to make out what's actually there. Also, fun, I just kind of glossed over this. If you don't know what pointillism is, it is a very cool artistic style where you make a lot of dots, and when you zoom out, when you get some distance between you and the picture, your brain kind of pieces it all together as a picture. But when you get closer to it, all you're going to see are the dots. So instead of using like brush strokes or fine lines or anything like that, it's just a different way to create visual art. I guess that's your art word for the day, if you didn't know what pointillism is. But yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of tough for me to grasp everything that's going on. But I think what's most important is that I do get the gist of this. I understand the weight. I have the emotional component to this, and the vocal pain. And I think that's really what is at the heart of this track. And, honestly, when it comes to black metal, sometimes me being able to get the emotional component is pretty good. Sometimes I don't even get that. I do like the drums work on here, though. I'd like to hear more of that in the 5 tracks ahead of us, but there were probably 3 or 4 good cymbal sections in here. And yeah, I like that more dexterous cymbal work. And it's something that I find if I am going to enjoy black metal, it's the cymbals, dude. If you've got a good drummer in your black metal band, you're grabbing my attention somehow, and that's putting you already a leg up over most other black metal groups. Let me dig into some lyrics on this one, see what's up there. All right, not a lot going on here with the lyrics. I'm using some human translations from lyricstranslate.com, which I'm hoping are a bit better than the Google AI translated stuff. The title of this album and this title track is There Was a Forest. And this song is a series of 3-line stanzas that begin with there was a forest where, and then it describes what this forest did. So the first stanza says there was a forest where the greed of the human was nothing more than a heavy past. There was a forest where the bark of the trees reflected the beauty of a lost world. There was a forest where the chants of the night used to awaken the sun of another life. Sun as in the star. There was a forest where the sanctuary of the skies watered the dry lands of the gods. That's the entire track right there. So it's interesting because it seems to be a forest in the future. Humanity's greed is nothing but a heavy past, that these dried lands, probably what was once destroyed by humanity, and industrialization is now watered by the skies. There is a reflection of a beauty of a lost world, which I think is interesting too, because it portrays a lot of what happened prior to this time as a negative. But it does understand that there is some beauty in what was, that it wasn't entirely negative. But all of this is spoken about in the past tense, that this era of humanity preceded this forest's existence, and that precedes now, the time that this story is being told. The last 4 lines of the track are just a repetition of there was a forest. It's interesting. It presents itself as maybe even post-Earth, at a time that humanity tried to destroy the planet. They died out, and what was left was a beautiful forest that reflected some of the past, but all of that is gone now. It's an interesting topic for depressive black metal because it's kind of beautiful. Maybe it's just because of the depressive black metal that I've checked out in the past, but usually there's a nihilistic bend to it, almost a suicidal element, especially when we check out BSDM. DSBM? Yeah, that one. Where they're overly wrought with pain and sorrow. This isn't. There is a sadness that this forest no longer exists, but that's about it. I wouldn't necessarily call these lyrics pained at all. In a way, they kind of push the already extreme lyric or vocal style into more absurdism, because sometimes, at least, I can relate how the delivery of the words are with the words themselves. The intense feelings of loneliness and depression fit with this type of scream, but something like this doesn't. It makes the vocal delivery stand out even more, at least for me. All right, let's push forward into track 2 then. Check out our first double-digit length. This one goes over 10 minutes. Let's dive in.
Ferme-la. L'arme physique, vous me déféquez par la gueule et vous me noyez dans mon déjection. disparaître.
You know, at first the vocals, the spoken word sounded calm, but it took on a bit of disgust for a moment, right?
Trop loin.
Interesting. It almost sounded like they were giving a speech at a party of some sort, a gathering. What started out as rather clean vocal delivery ended up giving a lot of grit to it. Like there was anger or disgust in it. You know, this almost borders into the realm of black gaze, doesn't it? I mean, there's certainly some more blackened elements, but it's also very gazy. Gothic metal. That's what this reminds me of. The slower tempo, the incredibly emotive chord progressions. It's like blackened Gothic metal with a dash of gazy atmosphere. Is there a ducking going on with the bass kick too? I don't know, the bass kick sounded like it was chopping up the guitar work. Now see, this delivery I can work with. We had this during the first verse as well, but shifted to the higher pitched screeching in the last section. The triplet kicks, that's nice. So this track has a general rising and falling pattern to it that we didn't really see much of on the first track. And particularly it's because of these lighter sections that are splitting up some of the heavier ones. Although I guess they have just been transition moments, haven't they? Yeah, this section with the arpeggiating guitar feels very gazy. Maybe closer to the realm of dream pop, but that's still like gaze adjacent. A little bit of tension in the chord progression stats, how the brighter sounds, because it's just arpeggiating, so it follows the chord progression. But the brighter tone also brings some positivity to this track against the heaviness of the guitars. See, like this is really focusing on dreariness here. In a way that the last section wasn't necessarily. The guitar sounds like it's being chopped up, like it has ducking against the bass kick. It's really interesting. Yeah, okay, that's, because, all right, so ducking is when in your workstation, you will tell this instrument to lower its volume or this track to lower its volume when this other track is playing. And it's usually done for stuff like bass kick, stuff that you're not going to hear all the time, but you want to make sure it cuts through something else that's taking up a lot of space. And that's what it sounds like here, a really sharp ducking that brings the volume down to 0, where usually you're just going to decrease it a little bit to carve out some space for that other sound to come through. But the other way this could be done too is with a kill switch, which is just a way to quickly turn on and off your guitar, so that you can create this very sharp stops and starts to an otherwise solid sound. You just strum once and then you can hit your kill switch and turn your guitar off and on really quickly. I don't know. I mean, it could also just be done in post too, just chopping up the recorded line. I'm not sure what process they went about to do this, but it creates a very distinct sound in here because already black metal uses quicker attacks, 16th notes on guitars. There is usually a da 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 da. It's a bit softer though. I normally wouldn't use a sound of da 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 da, that very sharp staccato stoppage. But that's what we get here. And it kind of takes the 16th note attack, which is already rather aggressive, having this constant, 16 notes per bar being played. It feels oppressive. There's a lot of sound going on there. And just leaning into that, focusing on it even more, bringing to attention all of those attacks very clearly by putting space between them. It exacerbates the already oppressive feeling that black metal typically has. But what's interesting is that we don't focus on it too much in here. The original guitar tone, the attack itself, isn't anywhere near as present in this track because of so much processing going on. We mostly get a altered sounds on the guitars rather than the original tone. And much like shoegaze is fond of, we hear some of this in here too, where the attack is so de-emphasized in the final sound of the guitar. Maybe that's why it's done. Because in order to actually apply the attack in this sound, maybe that's impossible. Maybe because of all the effects they have on the guitar, the distortion, the layers, the reverb, whatever they have to make it as large and fuzzy as it is, that the attack is getting lost in the effects. So in order to create the sharp stop that you would hear from putting the pick against the string again, they just do it this way with ducking or a kill switch or whatever. I don't know. It's interesting because my ear immediately picked it up right at the beginning of the track, but also because it works. Rhythmically, it pairs well with what black metal already does. That's it's an interesting idea there. I'm surprised I haven't heard it in other black metal. Tempo. This band likes to speed things up and slow things down. We actually saw this a couple of times in track 1 as well. It's rough. Usually there's a transition where this phrase, this section is over. We're moving to a new riff, a new, maybe we're moving into a chorus or something like that. And there's just a tempo change with it and you can't anticipate it. The drummer doesn't do any foreshadowing for this. There isn't a drum fill that introduces the new feel so that you can expect it coming in on beat 1. We were doing 4/4 at this tempo. Now we're doing 3/4 at a slower tempo. And it's jarring every single time. I'm curious what all of this is supposed to represent. Is it purely musical, that this riff just doesn't sound good at a faster or slower tempo, so when it's time to play the riff, they decided that it needs to be faster or slower? I don't know. I don't know if it's purely musical or if there's thematic reasoning behind it, but they always come out of nowhere. Like I said, there's no way to anticipate it, and it always throws me off. I have to get my bearings again. Which, for track one, looking at the lyrics, I can't really find anything in there that would line up thematically, so it feels more of a musical decision there. I'm curious if that's how it's going to be throughout this whole album. We'll find out when we hit the lyrics on this one and see if I can find any synergy there. I'm not a huge fan of it subjectively. I get that it has uses, but I wish it would be paired a little better with smoother transitions. Give us accelerandos or retardandos or foreshadowing, some way to help me feel like I'm moving into the next idea a little bit more fluidly. On the idea of accelerandos and retardandos, we do have them in both of these tracks, but I don't think that they're purposeful. There are several moments in both of these songs where I feel like the song is speeding up, and I listen, I'm like, yeah, it's a little faster, but are we actually, are we still rising? And then it just kind of settles back into where it was, or it slows down a little bit. I'm like, are we slowing down? And then it catches back up. And it almost feels like someone in the band is dragging or rushing, and the rest of the band hear it and they try to keep up, but then it's like, oh, let's stabilize. And it's these little temporal imperfections within the track. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's good. It is interesting, though. I think most people aren't even going to hear them. I think even if I wasn't listening as intently, I wouldn't hear them. But listening to this music, or classically, trying to understand all that it's doing, I'm very sensitive to little temporal fluctuations like this. And it's always interesting because it doesn't lead into a full retardando or a full accelerando. It doesn't take us smoothly into a new tempo. It's a temporary fluctuation that eventually resets itself to the proper speed. That's something I suppose we've heard in black metal before, doom metal also, which there's also some doomy elements. I think the beginning of this song kind of reminded me a bit of a doomy vibe. But it's never disruptive. Nowhere near as disruptive as we've heard it in doom metal before. But I do think it's an interesting characteristic that we've heard in 100% of the tracks so far. And once again, I kind of have questions. Is this purposeful, or is it just a byproduct of the way that they play and perform? Is it a flub that they just leave in because it's barely noticeable anyways? On to things I have a bit more understanding of. I find this really interesting atmospherically. Something clicked with me at the beginning of this track, and I mentioned shoegaze, and I'm curious if anybody else feels that parallel here. Part of it, I'm sure, is probably the emotive chords and the fuzzy atmosphere. This is exactly what shoegaze also is. This, I feel, has more aggressive playing. Shoegaze tends to have more effects, or at least does a better job of covering up the original tone. I can still hear the 16th notes on the guitars here, where in most shoegaze I can't. And of course, the drum work here is not gazy at all. It's intense, as metallic drumming should be. But there's still a lot of crossover. The Venn diagram between this style of black metal and shoegaze is pretty big. There's a big chunk there in the middle that crosses over, but also the dreary elements of this and the overperformed emotional component is, I think, how I'm going to describe this, reminded me a lot of gothic metal. And that is another genre that I kind of have a tough time getting into because of the buy-in. I don't necessarily accept the overdramatic qualities in the performance. But I do find it interesting that parts of this track, and I suppose a couple of parts in the first track too, when the energy comes down a little bit and we focus on something that is just incredibly dreary, really focusing on the harmonies going on more so than any sort of aggression. Yeah, very gothic metal. And I find this interesting because if I had to classify this, black metal, probably depressive black metal, but it's more nuanced than that. This is not just straight up black metal here. And I think that's what's making it a bit more palatable for me in places. This is still not something I'm going to listen to on my own, but we've listened to black metal in the past, and we've even checked out full black metal albums in the past where I've even admitted, I just wish it could be over. I wish I was done making the reaction. I just want to pop the headphones off my head and listen, do something else, listen to something else. This isn't that. I'm not going to say I'm enjoying this, but I've certainly heard a lot worse. And I think a lot of it comes down to the way the atmosphere is crafted on this, the way that the chords represent themselves in the mix, and in the atmosphere, the emotional component of it. There's a lot of things in here. Oh, and the drums too, being a bit more dynamic than just blast beats and 16th note bass kicks for 10 minutes straight. Speaking of the 10 minutes straight, here's something else about this. There's not a lot of sections to this track. I think I maybe heard 3 or 4 unique ideas within this, which means that the average time per section is going to be over 2 minutes in length. Which doesn't seem like a long time, but when so much of these ideas are similar, they're all going to be heavy, weighty, depressively or melancholically atmospheric. There's a lot of similarity. We do have 10.5 minutes here, but I'd say like 8 of it is similar enough to say it's a unified sound. The rhythms might change. The types of vocals might change, but the guitars sound the same. They're all playing the same moody chords. Maybe we have different chords specifically, but the intervals between the chords and the specific modes of the chords are going to be similar enough because they all have to be moody. They have to have this depressive melancholy to them. So it's not like they have all of the chords to play with. It kind of reduces it down to just the sad ones. It makes it so that there's not a lot of chords to pick from. In a lot of ways, this track in particular reminds me of post-rock. Texture and harmony over everything else with extended explorations of specific ideas. I think for what this is going for, this idea of intense depression, the idea of sitting within these dreary atmospheres for extended amounts of time works. It sells the idea that this isn't something quick that you can get over with in a couple of minutes. This takes time. It takes a toll on the person who's experiencing it. I appreciate that artistically, but I will say that this is probably going to be a positive thing in some of y'all's opinion, but I sort of drifted during moments in this track, stopped paying as much attention, and I suppose just allowed my brain to go where the music took me. I wasn't necessarily thinking about anything in particular. It's not like I started wondering if my stove was still on or something like that. But I wasn't focused on the music. I find the pacing here to be just a little too slow for me at times. Maybe that's a good thing. But there are many moments that sort of just are, and plenty of times where I said to myself, oh, they're going to do this again. After, 8 bars, 16 bar phrase, I figure, we've been in this section for 4 repetitions now. That surely has to be the end of it, right? And then they started again. I'm like, oh, geez, we have 4 more ahead of us then, don't we? And that's when I realized that, the song kind of has a slower pace to it. It doesn't mind taking its time. I think the last thing I need to bring up then is just the vocals on this one. I appreciated the spoken word at the beginning. That was a little different. And the lower pitched harsh vocals in here, which I thought I could accept a little more. They were less absurd, less extreme, and I had an easier time buying into those types of vocals. Now, I still have no idea what was being said, and even if I could understand through the delivery, it's still in French, so I wouldn't be able to understand it anyways. But there's something about that tone and the texture that just works a little bit better for me. Interestingly, though, it was frequently moved back into the shrill shrieks, so kind of lost me there too. And we had those shrieks over a very quiet, pensive moment, which the sheer contrast cracked me up. It's kind of strange to say that I'm laughing at depressive black metal, but it is, like I said, to me, it's a very high buy-in. This is very extreme, and I think it's going to take a specific person to really engage with this, all of this at face value. I don't think your average person is going to be able to do that. But that's normal when you get to the extremes of anything, not just black metal. I had the same problem. What is it? We still have comments on None So Vile, Cryptopsy. Is that the band? And the lyrics are so extreme that it becomes almost parody to me. And I've had some great conversations in the comments of that video too about sort of comparing it to B horror, stuff that's just way over the top. And yeah, I get it in comparison, but when I was listening to that, all I could think of is this is absurdly graphic to a point that it's almost funny. It's too over the top. So all sorts of, extreme art, whether it's going to be performance or visual or music, metal, death metal, black metal, any sort of avant-garde, anything. It just has a higher buy-in, and not everyone's going to be able to meet that and approach it on, the face level. All right, let's dive into some lyrics on this one. The lyrics here are grotesque, and I think that's giving them a bit more credit, making them sound not as bad as they are. It starts off, and this is where the clapping happens, and it sounds like the person's up on a stage, and it says, "Silence, silence, shut up." There is a massive language shift here. And then this moves into emphatic maggots. You defecate through your mouths and drown in your own excrement. I had mentioned that somewhere in this spoken word part, it kind of shifted towards an anger, or what was the word I used? Disgust, maybe? And yeah, the lyrics line up with that really well. It goes on to describe an evening with an orchestra. It's playing a famous symphony tonight, and the entirety of describing the people that are in the orchestra, as well as the people who are present for the performance, it's a constant negative view of them. Calls them filthy, slimy sores, forcing our narrator to join against his will these garbage-dwelling musicians. Says it's a cursed orchestra accompanying my suicide. If this was the edgiest thing in here, well, what was I going to say? If I would tell you this was the edgiest thing in here, I'd be lying. But that is an incredibly edgy line, and it's line 6, 7 of this track, right at the front. Talks about the woodwinds that they're burnt out, drugged up bums. The violinists have their eye sockets removed. The timpanist beats children, that the cymbals are being played. They recount the disgusting rape of a woman. It gets worse from here. I'm not quite sure what the purpose of this exercise is, but finally we make it to the people who are here. He says the height of horror is the audience's vision of these demonic harmonies, despicable and repulsive people. He says, with twilight eyes, they witness the eradication of noble values, but they pay for not seeing clearly as they leave their own hearts here. He finishes it up, asking if his hanging body is the swinging of the beat at the gates of hell. The lyrics to the first track could never have set me up for this. What in the world? I can understand a contempt for maybe the rich that he is rubbing elbows with in this room. But what is with the anger towards the musicians? Is it simply guilty by association here? Is it a musical thing? Anything that isn't the edgiest black metal is obviously played, performed, and written by ugly people. I don't know. I try not to ascribe lyrics to the lyricist. I don't want to say that the person who wrote these lyrics feel this way. I think art should allow us to visit the darker side of humanity and the human condition. But this, I don't know. It starts to cross a line for me. I don't see the purpose of most of this. It's just sort of here, and most of it feels edgy for edgy's sake. Shock value is what I'm getting out of this. I think there are ways to actually say this with more vitriol and more bites using softer language, and that's sort of the double-edged sword of this. Much like the extremity of the sounds, me not being able to take that as seriously because I can't meet it at that level, I find the extremity here to be over the top too, removing the sincerity of it, or possible sincerity, in placement of shock value. I don't know if that's actually what's going on here. I don't know if that's the intention, but that's how I read it because of the extremity of it. Moving on, we are going to head into our longest track. This one just shy of 12 minutes, and I believe it's called Cicatrice, but knowing French, I probably even mispronounced that. Let's dive in. We started off a bit moody, but we've shifted into the discordant here. Going for more of an eerie or haunting vibe, more so than the sorrowful element that we've seen in the past two tracks. Also, production-wise, hitting something a bit more minimalist, which allows the drums to open up a bit. While I understand this has slightly different riffs, different drum patterns, the vocal melody is different, so much of this and what I would comment on is, at least so far, pretty much the same as what I would say about tracks 1 and 2. Even just like track 2, a couple of minutes in, we cut to a momentary minimalistic element and then scream over it and it cracked me up again. We have the bass coming in with a bit more movement. And here's another part where this riff, this whole section is outstaying its welcome a bit. That's a piano, but was that also a piano in the last section? Maybe it was. Maybe it's just a bit on the higher side. Kind of hit the clunkiness of it all. The illusion of something a bit more melodic, but turning it into a riff rather than a melody. This is a nice moment. I fear it will be short-lived, but I'm enjoying this contrast.
M'abandonner à ce flot infecté par l'amertume.
It went on a bit longer than I expected though, so I'll take what I can get.
Cicatrice, il pose son voile sur mon âme écœurée.
I'll be interested to see about the lyrics. And see what's going on with these really quick rising and falling, these peaks and valleys here. Really quick peaks and valleys. This stuff is just, it's flipping a switch on and off here. There's so much reverb on the vocals too. Interesting choice. That track, given that it had so many mellow moments to it, I really got to engage with some of the more musical elements aside from the texture of it all. Because the texture, I've mentioned the extremity of the music a lot today, but I really think it's more about the texture. The chords aren't extreme. The screaming is an extreme style, but I don't think it has to be that extreme. Screaming is still fine, even to my ears. I think a lot of it is not the composition, but the packaging. The way that all this is wrapped up and presented to the listener. I think, now, I'm about to say this, I understand that what I'm about to propose drastically changes the music, the artwork itself. It would create something different, not better. But I really wonder what would happen if you took the music here and applied it to a different sound. String quartet. Less extreme, maybe more high fidelity, electric guitars. For my ears, my personal taste, what if this went more towards a punky direction? What if we approached more of the atmospheric post-hardcore side of things? And that started making me think about the vocal direction. Because there were two parts in here. Now, granted, they were moments. It was more of like a couple of syllables, more so than an entire section. But there were still a couple of moments in here when I thought, okay, I'm kind of getting the emotional resonance. I'm kind of understanding the screaming against the lull, against the pensive moments. And I thought, well, if that was a post-hardcore scream, that might have actually worked for me. More of a traditional Fry scream than this DSBM version. And I think once I started to click with this idea that a different, albeit still harsh vocal style, and maybe changing the production of the instrumentation, I might actually enjoy this. I have listened to more emotional, textured, atmospheric post-hardcore in the past that I've enjoyed. Granted, I still would want some melody out of this, regardless of what style it is. But I could really imagine enjoying this as a post-hardcore track, as a string quartet, exploring this emotional landscape. Maybe no vocals there, but I think that the chord progressions on this track are solid, as they have been this entire album. That's the one thing that I've really been able to praise on here, is capturing this feeling. Now, unfortunately, I haven't really found that feeling worked too well pairing with the lyrics. The first track was okay. The second track was a complete miss for me. But I wonder then too if maybe with the different lyrics that I might also enjoy this. It's less about this not really being my cup of tea, as much of it is it's death by a thousand cuts. The music's not bad. It's just so many decisions aren't ones that I enjoy. And I can take a handful of them at a time, but basically this song makes every decision that I'm not a big fan of and puts it together and pairs it with some stuff that I could really enjoy. But there's just too many elements to it that I'm just not grooving with. And I think if I could remove some of them, swap them out for some things that I do like, I could probably really get along with this album. Now, if the lyrics are going to be as edgy as the last track, it might still just be a one-time listen for me. But I think I'm starting to understand why people enjoy this, what they come to it for, and that it's really not as difficult as a listen for me as I think it is, or as the way that it felt when the album started. I really think that a couple of small tweaks, not really much to the composition, but again, the packaging, I'd kind of like this. So that was an interesting realization, and I wonder if anybody else feels that way about it. If this isn't your cup of tea, what if the guitars were just reined in a little bit? What if the drums weren't as muddy? What if the vocals were still screamed, but in a different harsh vocal, maybe something you enjoy more? What if they were growls? What if they were more traditional fries? What if they had that metalcore yell to them? You know, something that was more palatable to you. Because the atmosphere is still solid. And I got to hear more of the pure harmonic stuff in the more minimalistic sections, which I guess is where I want to go next. This song really pushes into those moments more often than any of the others. Not only do we have the one at the beginning, but we had 3 or 4 at the end as we went on this constant rising and falling roller coaster. And like I said, I want to get into the lyrics and see what's going on there. Musically, it was very jagged. A whiplash, like a bipolar track, and maybe that's what they're going for. It felt kind of odd for me. Every time I felt like we were getting to go somewhere, we just 180. And we start to get that rolling and then a 180, and we couldn't get any momentum going on. And again, that's not a bad thing. It's an artistic choice. That's the way they wanted their story to be told musically. Very cool ideas. It didn't really work for me sonically, though. I think that's more of an artistic choice, and I hope that I can find some thematic elements to help me appreciate that. But I can see how it could be used artistically or thematically. Musically, I was just getting frustrated as the song was already kind of grinding on me a little bit, and then we just had this back and forth, and every time, especially the more somber moments, the lighter, more minimalistic sections, I was really hoping we could get somewhere with them, and every time we started to build into the next idea, we flipped the switch into the distortion instead of building on that. So that might have just made it even more of a frustrating listen for me than already it being some back and forth stuff. But I do like the piano in here too. I don't know if this is the first time we've heard the piano. We've had violin before. We had clean vocals in here in a couple places. I think the piano is the first time on the album, though. It was nice. I kind of wish we got some melody out of it, though. I think we had more lead instrumentation than ever. We also had 2 higher-pitched guitar sections. We had a lick in the middle of the track, and then we had 2 guitars on the side, way above the foundation guitar in pitch, playing along in the same rhythm that the vocals were screaming in. And I like these moments, but they're melodic adjacent, where instead of playing chords, we do have a melody, but it's a 2-beat melody or a 4-beat melody, and it's something that we can repeat on loop rather than have linear writing to it. I really want some linear stuff here, but I also appreciate that that's not what this album is. This album is atmosphere and pained screaming, and I think as far as what it wants to be, this album is excelling. We're halfway through it, and I'm not quite at the point where I'm done. I want the day to be over. I want the recording session done with here. But I can feel myself getting there, especially as I mentioned in that track, there really isn't a lot for me to add to the conversation. A lot of that song felt like what we explored on track 2. The structure is a little bit different, but the bass work, the guitar work, the vocals, their roles within it, and the atmospheres they're exploring, it's not really different. There's nuances in there probably that I'm not picking up on, and what I am hearing, I don't know if it's really worth just repeating myself at the end of every track. But I am glad that I got a little bit different of a perspective on this song after that one. Just something to talk about, I suppose. I don't think it would be a very interesting listen if I just played the next 3 songs back to back and said, well, that's it, folks. So I'm glad I can still find some stuff that I think is worth bringing up. But I do worry that the next 3 tracks, the next 30 minutes or so of this album, I won't have much to analyze because I've already talked about the broader strokes that this album is exploring, and I'm not really getting much past that. Let me hit some lyrics on this one. And finally, we have a track where I feel like the lyrics actually match what's going on in the music. Now, granted, this still feels very edgy and shock value for shock value's sake, but at least I think that the extremity of the lyrics match the extremity of the music and also embody the emotions of the music. It is a song about suicide. It starts off, says, many times I've wanted to put an end to the impenetrable darkness that is my life, to this lake of blood and tears that is my wounded existence. Many times I've seen the shadow of this rope on the walls of my gray and overwhelming remorse, inviting me to its macabre dance that would free me from the choppy sea of my madness. I don't really want to go further into that. You get the gist of the track if you've just heard those 2 stanzas. It continues to talk about this amorphous force. It does have a deformed face, but it is the symbolic representation of his suicidal tendencies. He says that he carries his vulnerability to agony and that this is what emboldens that. But most of it is contemplating death. So yeah, we finally have a track that I think matches in all elements. And on the one hand, it's nice to see this thematic synergy. On the other hand, I don't know why I let myself read these lyrics. Let's dive into this next track then. See what's going on with, I think, the shortest track on this album. No, track 5 will be the shortest. All right, let's dive into track 4. So that is a glockenspiel though, which makes me think that that's what I heard in the last track too, prior to the piano coming in. Yeah, see, and instead of building off of that idea, we just shift to something totally different. Sort of synth pad droning on in the background. lot of drum work incorporating the chord song and the bass kick, but it's so muddy. I wish I could hear a little bit more of the detail of that. And it's contending with the buzzsaw guitars too, so it's interesting that this line, those three notes feel like they're ascending, and we repeat them over and over, and then it descends. It feels like it should be rising into something that fails at the last moment. Interesting that they didn't crossfade it. They just stopped it and then started this new idea. Well, why? I find it funny that just the previous analysis segment, I brought up the idea that if this were in a different sound, then I might enjoy it a bit more. But I think straight up, that final section, those last 40 seconds or so, that was an emo song in a Blackened production. But the harmony, the twinkling guitars, the xylophone coming in at the time, at the end of it, that's all emo. I actually found myself really enjoying what's on paper in that moment. and kind of in my head hearing it with more of an emo delivery than this more Blackened style. But it would fit in really well. Oh man, that's wild. That's wild. Um, I think this might be my favorite track on the album. A little bit of a slip there at the end. I was moving between, like a mid to a high as far as my enjoyment level of it. And then we just had that odd transition. And I really hope the lyrics explain that, because musically, it makes no sense to dip down to nothing for a beat and then have a minimal 2 bars, 3, 4 bars maybe tops, and then to go right back to the level we were at. I mean, we ever since minute 5, the song's been at like a solid 10. And then for the briefest moments, we dip it down to like a 1 and then bring it back up to a solid 10. It's such a bizarre choice. Musically, there's no fluidity to it at all. But maybe if there's a fake out, which is actually kind of what it feels like, a fake out ending. Maybe if there's a fake out in the lyrics too, I can kind of piece all that together. But musically, the fake out didn't really make any sense to me. It really did feel like an ending that just continued on, repeating what we were doing. But I enjoyed the first 4 minutes and 30 seconds or so of this track. The lighter instrumentation, the more minimal production, I enjoyed that. And I think they still found a way to introduce intensity into it without having to pull that out of the muddy, massive bass kicks and the huge fuzzy guitars. They found a way to introduce it not through production, but through composition. And there wasn't that big of a disparity between the vocal delivery and the atmosphere around it, even though this was a quiet, light, minimal section with those really harsh vocals. It didn't feel as odd of a combination as we had seen earlier in this album. So I do enjoy being able to hear the music of it. And I've enjoyed this album when it decides to dip down into those more minimalistic or softer segments. And I'm glad that we got an elongated version of it. I think previously most of them have been 8 bars tops. I think at one time we had a 25 or 30-second one. I think that was in track 3. So it's starting to see a little bit longer, but still 30 seconds out of 11 or 12-minute songs is such a small fragment. This was almost half of the track in this lighter section. I really appreciated that, but there's something else that this track offers that none of the others have either. Melody. I just got talking about how much I wanted melody in this, and we got a little bit of it. We got some xylophone work in here that was pretty cool. Not xylophone, glockenspiel work in here that was pretty cool. We had a guitar solo, like legit linear melodic writing guitar solo. Most of this was contained between like minutes like 5 and I don't know, 6, 7.5 maybe. It was a small portion of the track, but it was still nice to get some linear melody in here. And I thought that it worked well because eventually we ran this guitar solo underneath the vocals. And we had a denser layering here that, oddly enough, the production had room for. I think part of it is that this guitar just cuts through the noise. It's a very thin, sharp sound. But there just isn't a lot of high-end stuff happening. And it leaves so much room up here that I never even realized is empty. I think you could really put anything up there, a higher pitched, up in the higher range of a piano, or the violin has sat up there a couple of times. This solo guitar, the bells, the glockenspiel, like when they exist in the music, and I kind of wish we heard this stuff more often, but I understand that thematically having this weight, this bleakness, this darkness of tone and lower notes absolutely fits with the vibe of all of this. But I do think that when we get these higher sounds, it actually introduces more sorrow. Part of it is that the guitar during the solo was aiming for something a bit bluesier. I wouldn't say it was great blues guitar, but it did try to blend a little bit of that bluesy sound into this blackened metal. But to me, it pierces in a way that I don't think the vocals quite do. There's something about the instruments at this range that creates a peace or a tranquility, a brightness, maybe even, that just never gets obtained. Most of this album has been bleak, but these instruments represent hope unobtainable. And I think that adds even more weight to it, more emotional despair to these tracks. And I think it's kind of a shame. It seems like a real big missed opportunity to elevate this music even further in this direction that they want to go in. And they're showcasing it here. This isn't even just me hypothesizing, oh, this would sound great if they did this. I mean, here, this is perfect. A showcasing of what you can achieve with this. And it's there. The space is empty. Just put some stuff higher up there, slower played melodic stuff, and it really elevates the work. And yet, what are we, like 45 minutes into this album? And we've heard that for 2 minutes tops. And I think that's a real big missed opportunity to elevate it. I'm not saying I want to feel more depressed while listening to it, but if they want to make depressive music, they did it really well here, and it makes everything else feel a little lesser than. So I reiterate myself, more melody, please. It's not even just palatability for me anymore. This is a great example of how it can make the work even better. All right. Let's see. We touched on melody, quiet, minimalistic stuff, and the interesting emo parallel in the final 40 seconds. Let's see some lyrics. And here we have another woe is me style tale. Calls himself a shadow of a shadow. Says no one can believe that I exist. No one can see me, and oftentimes I've asked myself, what about me? Says that I carry the worst of infections and spread it against all who I love. Says, forgive me, for I should not have remained trapped in your lives. So he almost feels as if he's a burden to those around him. He asks why he's been burdened with this terrible curse. Calls it a syndrome of loving an unspeakable force, one that does not love him in return. Doesn't necessarily know who he is either. There's no... He doesn't understand. Says, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? There's an understanding of himself as a human, but not as a person with goals. Sure, a history, but not one that leads in a path. There's a lack of understanding of the self, even though he understands his existence. Talks about solitude resting on his heart at all times. And about an other. Says, you. Do you still want to melt into my swollen heart? The dance floor is more slippery for me who has never been there. You don't know who I am, and nor do I. But I am ugliness in makeup. I am the plague that is cured and joy scarred. I'm the dilapidated cross, the atheist Jesus, and the mad Buddha. And that's how the track ends. An interesting way to wrap things up. Most of this track is, I don't know who I am. And even leading up to those final lines, he says, I don't know who I am. But then lists all of what he is, which is mostly contradictions. The plague cured, the atheist Jesus, the ugly makeup. And it presents someone who has such a negative view on themselves that even their sheer existence is contradictory. Why do they exist at all? Why do they carry this burden of loneliness? Why do they infect everyone around them? I have a really tough time with lyrics like this because generally, and this is going to be a very wide swath that I'm painting here and not applicable to every single scenario, but generally, if everyone in your life tries to avoid you like the plague, you're usually the problem. But the thing is that it's a problem that can be fixed. And I think this is a thing that, I don't know, it irritates me because it's usually a personality thing. It's what you say, it's how you say it, it's the topics you bring up out of the blue, it's the way you treat people. These are all things that can be improved to become a better human, to become someone that people would want to spend time with. I say this from experience. I've talked about this in the past that the person I was in my teens is nowhere near the person I am today. I have done a lot of growing up over the years. I've done stuff, I've said stuff that I would never do today. That's part of growing up. We've all made mistakes. We've done stupid stuff in the past. None of us are perfect, and we need to learn how to forgive ourselves and move on, and more importantly, improve. So all of this, woe is me, I'm so lonely, I wish people would spend time with me. The answer is really clear, dude. Just improve yourself. Be better than you were yesterday. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too close to this track that it's just infuriating because it's not just this song. I hear this same sentiment on the internet all the time. People always in this position of woe is me, no one wants to get to know me, the world is cruel, and I'm so lonely. And like, yes, dude, there are certainly other hurdles than just have a better personality. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily easy either. That takes time. It takes self-awareness. It takes reflection. But some people will drive everyone away from them and then act the victim. That's just so infuriating to me. And I've done it. It's one of the things that I find most disgusting about my past. And it's like I said, maybe this is just too close to me. This is not exactly where I wanted to segue this. But I did go and read some of the context that the requester had sent to me when they requested this album. And they mentioned that it was a two-member French-Canadian depressive and atmospheric black metal band. I picked up on most of that with a little bit of research. This is their second album, and they were around 17 when they created it. And I think this is really interesting because, as I mentioned, this is around the time of the age I was when there were definitely some feelings similar that I might have been able to relate to more with this track specifically than others. And I'll be honest, dude, misanthropy, yeah. I vaguely even remember using that word to describe my relationship to humanity as a whole, as I was a bit of an edgelord back then. So, yeah. I hope that the two of them have grown up a little bit from 17-year-old them writing this kind of stuff, but it helps put perspective on it, if nothing else. And I think at 17, it's not great, but I think more understandable to be an edgelord. Being an edgelord in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s is just, I hate to use the word, but cringe. As a 17-year-old, okay, it's not great, but it's passable. You're trying to find yourself. And, the path you went down's not the best one, but you have time to correct that. At 50, if you're still an edgelord, what have you been doing for the past 50 years of your life? You've had so much time to figure things out. They also say, though, that this is the one true piece of art that has managed to encapsulate so many powerful, unique emotions for them. That the album is depressive, dark, and misanthropic, yet at the same time poetic, passionate, and beautiful. It's the kind of music that isn't for everyone, and they understand that and even agree with it. That their first time listening to it barely resonated with them at all. I appreciate that. An acknowledgement that the first time can be rough, especially if it isn't something you like or enjoy or even accustomed to. Particularly because that's my placement here. But they say that to get the most out of this music, you should associate it with something personal, that there's beauty through the distortion just as life offers beauty through hardship. They asked me not to overlook the faint melodies beneath the weight, and when things get too intense, to simply close my eyes and enjoy the ride. I find some of this really interesting because there's not a lot of melody in here. There are melodic qualities at times, but a lot of this is just arpeggiation. There is a lot of arpeggiation in here. And there are a few looped riffs that are more melodic, but as far as like strong melodic ideas, true melody, track 4 is really the only place we've heard it, and it was such a small portion of that track. But I do agree that there is beauty beneath the distortion here. It's a lot of the harmonic elements, the atmospheres crafted through the chordal progressions that are building honestly, it's a sad beauty. It's a depressive beauty. There's a gorgeous element to the chord progressions, but it's one steeped in sorrow. But what I can't really agree with here is that this is dark and misanthropic, but also poetic, passionate, and beautiful. Passionate, sure, but I have found very little poetic or beautiful elements, particularly related to the themes and the lyrics. But I suppose that's a subjective look at it, and I appreciate that some people might read these lyrics and find them to be incredibly poetic. I am also, let me put this out there just to clear things up, I'm also reading a translation of it, so there might be some stuff from the French that I'm losing in translation that makes it less poetic to me. But I find a lot of the themes quite repugnant, and that's not helping me find beauty or poetry in the lyrics either. So there's a couple of forces working against me in finding beauty in the lyrics. So I'm not going to immediately toss that out, but I'm not finding that in my experience with the lyrical side of things. All right, I think that's going to prepare us to move into the final third of this album. Speaking about misanthropy, this next title, I'm probably going to butcher the French, but I looked at it and it seems really close to Profound misanthropy in English. So I went and checked the translation on it, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm not expecting the lyrics to this one to be up my alley either, but of course we'll do a lyrical dive on it after we check it out. This is the shortest track on the album. It's like 8 minutes long or something like that. Let's dive in. We have another haunting sound beneath all of this light synth again. Lots of reverb on it, allowing it to almost deviate into the realm of drone, but there is a passing pitch to it. I always find it interesting when they add in eerie elements. So a lot of temporal inconsistencies on this one though, more so than any other track. Impressive transition there from the lower into the higher dry screen. I was hoping for another lead melody. I'll take a melodic riff though. crescendo. Yeah, I think so. All right. Yeah, I find this interesting because after track 4, which I thought was one of the more interesting tracks on the album, as they explored a wider palette of ideas between textures and timbres and even atmospheres, they return to probably the most static track on the album. We have very minor modifications across the 4 distinct moments of this track. And I think I'd prefer to talk about them as modes if rather than sections, because most of what's going on is very similar between them. It might be a modification of what the drums are doing, or the addition of an instrument or two, a slight change to a melodic idea. But we don't see any wide sweeping changes like we typically see on other tracks as we move between section to section on those. This one feels more singular in focus than any of the 4 other tracks that precede it. For better or worse, I think that this slow burn evolution is great if that's your jam. And I think that this song does that better than any of the others. And I do like the micro adjustments that happen throughout in order to fully connect all of this into basically one long idea that's kind of chopped up into some smaller sections to it. But again, you really have to like that idea. And I kind of grew tired of it around minute 3 or so when I started to notice that it's kind of very all samey. I think though what they're doing is, again, it's great atmosphere. I think that they do that exceptionally well, and if you enjoy this, yeah, this band's doing a fantastic job of it. I'm not the audience though. There is one cool thing on this one, though. We've seen as the album pushes further and further on, more of a leaning towards eeriness or haunting ideas, particularly haunting arpeggiations around chordal movements. I find this to be really interesting because so far I've not heard anything in the lyrics that really push towards haunting, at least not in any way that isn't present in previous tracks. I'd say that the language of the album and the way it's presented, the syntax, the themes being used, it's all fairly consistent. No track feels really any different than another. Sort of like the music all encompasses this heavy, weighty, moody depression. The lyrics are also rather consistent in a hatred for something. And an anger that this person is still alive or being surrounded by these things they hate. And I guess the being alive thing lines up with that too, because in that song they hate themselves and they're tired of being around themselves. So yeah, most of these songs could come down to a contempt for something and a dread of continued existence alongside that. And so for the last couple of tracks to start to introduce eerier sounds doesn't really fit with the thematic ideas. It just seems to be something the album is doing, and it fits 100%. Bringing in these tones to bring a haunting element onto the depressive sounds already, it works. The emotions work well together, even just on a sonic level. There's good consonance in the combinations. It's effective. It's just, I have to wonder why. What's the artistic bend to it? What's the angle? It might just be that it sounds cool, so they did it. But I'm kind of curious why these two songs in particular here are the ones that have begun to show this side. And if they're going to continue it into this final track, it might be a really interesting evolution of the album. Instead of focusing on just each track in isolation, there could be this larger narrative of pushing away from sheer depression into this haunting vibe and leaning into it in the final 10 minutes of this album. But if they don't do that, and it just kind of is here in tracks 4 and 5, I have to ask why. What's the purpose behind that? Why these two tracks in particular? And I suppose it could have nothing to do with these two tracks. The albums, or the order that this was recorded in, could be absolutely nothing compared to the track listing. And maybe it's just a coincidence that these two songs are the ones that feature it most prominently, and they just happen to be back to back towards the end of the album. But it is something I picked up on this one, and I don't know, it's one of those patterns. That's kind of my whole thing when I listen to music, is pattern recognition. And then asking what the pattern means, and that's my analysis process. I just let y'all behind the curtain. There's a lot of experience in figuring out what patterns mean, but at the end of the day, it's just a lot of pattern recognition. And sometimes I'll see the pattern and just not be able to interpret it, though. And maybe there is no interpretation. That's always the other fun thing. It's one of my favorite parts about art criticism, whether it's music or painting or even novels. Some of the stuff that you read in novels, you're like, oh, obviously this color is a motif for that. And like the person who wrote it was like, nah, dude, I just like the color. But that's the fun thing about art, is everyone gets something different out of it. So let me dive into some lyrics for the Profound Misanthropy and see what kind of brightness we can involve ourselves in this time around. Okay, so this actually makes a bit of sense then. I mentioned that the song felt like a singularity, and it is. Lyrically, it looks to be a journey of sorts. It talks about going through the misty forests, the freezing rains, and into the dark mountains, finally landing upon underneath a gray and gloomy sky. It says that through the forest I have wandered from your tainted kingdoms. Under the rains I have wandered from your cursed race. In the dark mountains the winds have caressed my face, and under the gray and gloomy sky my soul rests in an eternal sleep. It wraps this up and says, in my solitude my body rests dead, far from your impure land, silently dead. Pretty straightforward. They have chosen death over life. Quite literally, not their own life, but humanity, the concept of life. They have chosen to go far from that and embrace death. Not even just solitude, but the removal of humanity itself. Life is gone from this person. Yeah, I mean, as far as a deep level of misanthropy goes, yeah, the lyrics capture that. And like I said, the music mostly being the same foundationally, but having small variations throughout, capture this feeling of the journey, of moving from one place to another with lots of micro thematic elements happening. You know, the forest and the rain and the mountains, and we're kind of moving through these portions. What's interesting is I felt like there were a lot more lyrics in that 8-minute song than 10 lines. I'm curious if they were just delivered rather slowly, or if there's some repetition in here, or maybe the third case, which is that some of it is just screams. I suppose that's also the case with something like this, or it could be the case with something like this. All right, that takes us to the final track then. Let's dive into this and see how they wrap this album up. Really interesting temporal dissonance between the piano and violin. It's locked back in. It's still just two instruments and they can't seem to get on the same page here. It's interesting to hear how many defining components of their composition shows up in this, just as much as it does in the metallic side. The harsh transitions, the temporal anomalies. I do like the increased presence of melody though. And counterpoint, something we didn't hear at all on the album. We even have theme in here, and I think, and variation. Beautiful. Strong dynamics too. Also, if I'm not mistaken, this section appeared in another one of the tracks, correct? Come on, this is good. These three chords we've definitely heard on this album somewhere, so how much of this is callback? I'm pretty sure we even heard these three chords in the arpeggiation that they're happening here too, just on guitar previously. That's a solid track right there. Gorgeously written, great technique, contrast and counterpoint, and beautiful melodies, and wonderful chord progressions, textured and layered writing. Did I say dynamics already? If not, dynamics. Callback, even. Theme and variation. Motif is present in here. It's beautiful. This is solid. Beyond that, we have instrumentation that I find rather palatable. We've done away with the muddy drums and the buzzsaw guitars and focus on just the lightness of violin and piano. There's also one really big element missing here. That's the vocals. And basically, a few tracks earlier, I asked, what if they created this music, but in a different packaging? And I said, I think I would like that. And I think this track is good proof of that. Granted, there is quite a bit of deviation in the compositional structure here. As I talked about, there is counterpoint, there's strong melody, there's layering on the melodic elements. There's definitely ideas in here that aren't really present in the composition of the rest of the album. I'll get into why I think that is in a moment, but just for right now, there is some stuff in here that makes it distinct and unique against the rest of the album. But I don't actually think it's that big of a stretch. I think that if you played this on their distorted guitars and their drums in the production that this album has been, I don't even think you'd recognize how different it is. It would fit in really well with everything else. There's also the harmonic element here. This one isn't quite as depressive as the other tracks, so there is that emotional shift too. But the sheer just listen at the end with the two pianos off on the side. That's really not too different than the two guitars off to the side throughout most of this album, or in the moments where they're unified, the two guitars and the bass. This idea of duality, of building harmonic ideas based off of arpeggiating ideas that are in support of each other, is really the backbone of a lot of this album, and it's what made up a good portion of the foundation of this track as well. And I think that's really cool because it shows that this style of music really isn't that distant from the rest of the music on here. It is, like I said, it is unique. It has its elements to it. But they make up such a small percentage of that. The core foundation of this track is really no different from the rest of the album. And I really love that. It's an odd choice, I think, sonically to wrap the album up on this. But narratively, I think it works. The atmosphere on this is quite a bit more relaxing. I don't necessarily want to say joyful, but definitely more positive than the depressive stuff this album's focused on. But there is a peace to this, not just in the textures of the instruments, but also the chords that they're playing. This is light. It's not even necessarily quiet or minimalistic. There are densely layered sections in here that reach the same volume as the peaks of the rest of the album. But it just sounds softer. The instruments carry less weight to them. The notes chosen, the chord progressions, the arpeggiations, the melodies, not necessarily soaring. We don't have freedom here, but we have certainly pulled ourselves out of the mud of the sorrow that this album has really persisted within. We have found a bit of a neutrality, and acceptance might be another good word. Peace through acceptance might be a great way to describe this. I feel like this is all purposeful. And I think it's what makes the end hit the way that it does. It's what makes the motifs and the callbacks work so well here. I don't think that this is a concept album. Not in the sense that there's a narrative through line here, but I do see a theme that runs through all of the tracks. There are a couple of songs that are a disgust with the self, disgust with humanity at large, not separating themselves from that, and also at least one track that flirts with suicidal tendencies. The final the final track with lyrics in it is one of death. And so this is the piece after that. This is the afterlife or the non-existence or whatever comes next. It might even represent some of the flashbacks, life going flashing before their eyes as their life force fades. And that might be what the motifs are leaning towards, the callbacks, little bits of this album seen in a slightly different light. The anger, the bitterness, the sorrow, all of that took them to this point, something they'd been looking forward to for at least a couple of tracks. And finding a calm here, transforming those old ideas into this new atmosphere, shifting not necessarily the note intervals in these melodies or these arpeggiations, but shifting the modes of the chords. What once was a lick within a melancholic atmosphere is that same lick within a peaceful atmosphere. And of course, the song ends with consonant harmony, a nice resolution to a chord progression, and peace. Not a big bombastic finale, but just an ending to a chord progression. There's also a triumphant, there's a buildup in the middle of this track as we add more and more layers. This is where the counterpoint comes in for the first time, and we actually get a three-way counterpoint here. This is, I think, easily the densest part of this entire album as far as melody is concerned. I'm not too sure what this represents, but I think it is interesting and important that the track doesn't end on a peak like this. Prior to the finale, we wind things down a little bit, and the final, 40 seconds, minute or something like that, is solo piano. Technically, two parts, one panned out to either side, but two hands, one person performing this piano part. It is, in a lot of ways, isolation, and these two parts, they begin to line up really well. No longer alongside each other or harmonizing, but getting really close to just being the same notes. This is the singularity of death, bringing everything that once was alive to the same points, finding that rest and peacefulness at the end as everything converges into one. Yeah. I'm of mixed opinion on this track. I love it. Don't get me wrong. Solid track right here. Would I enjoy it outside of the context of this album? Yeah, it's beautifully written. I think I would. Would I understand it though? And I don't think so. I think this really requires the rest of the album. Maybe not all of it. I think you could probably pull one of the you need the misanthropic one, so probably the one about the symphony. Was that track 2? And the one where he's tired of being alive. Was that Profound Misanthropies? Yeah, so tracks 2, 5, and then 6. And at that point, you're over the halfway line. You might as well just throw the rest of the album in because they're not filler. While I do think lyrically most of these tracks they run parallel to each other, all of them represent a different facet of the anger, loneliness, and misanthropy of the narrator. Again, I don't think it is designed to be a conceptual album in a narrative sense, but it all does capture various fragments of hatred, of disgust with the human race. So it all feeds into a larger idea, and understanding all of that, with track 5 being the death of our character, and then track 6 being this, the only peaceful or restful or even neutral emotional component of this album. It hits harder because of that. I think my entire understanding of this track and what I got out of it is based off of what we just listened to for the past 50 minutes. So, well, actually, I guess it's like an hour and a long time. 2 hours of listening here. It's, I would not have come to the same conclusion without that. So I don't think it works quite as well without the context of the album, but I'm not a real big fan of the album either. This puts me in an interesting pickle where if I wanted to show this to someone, I'm not sure I would or could. It really requires the rest of the album, but I don't personally know anyone who would enjoy this. I don't know anybody who listens to extreme metal at all. So that probably explains why this whole metal journey has been really interesting to me, because I have not had a mentor in my own life to lead me into these realms. But it's also a track that I can show somebody. They'd enjoy it. It's beautiful. It's well written, but they wouldn't get it. It's like a really tough film to watch with a satisfying ending. Kind of tough to make or to request somebody watch a difficult to watch film, especially if they're not into that type of movie already. A lot of people go to the movies for escapes, so I guess this portion doesn't really have anything to do with the music itself, but I do think it's interesting that I find I've very rarely been put in this position where I really like something. I'd like to expose someone else to this, but it would require exposing them to something that I know is not going to work for them and might even bring their mood down. Honestly, like my comparison, film is really the only place I have for this. It's just, it's intriguing to me. Like I said, I've never been in this position before regarding music. I was going to say let's break for lyrics, but that was an instrumental. That's going to wrap it up then. I'm not ready to wrap things up. Usually I like prep myself to start doing the outro spiel and stuff. These are my thoughts on this album from Gris, which I'm still pretty sure I mispronounced in there. What did you think, though? Did you enjoy this? Is there anything in here that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Do you have your own take, perspective, or opinion on this? Let me know. Put all of that, as well as anything else you'd like to add to the conversation, into the comment section below. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. UTC. We're going to do a live stream. Just hang out for like 2.5 hours, listen to some chill music, have some cool conversation. It's relaxed. It's a great way to learn about new music. If you can make it, if you have that 2-hour block open, I highly suggest you do. It's over on twitch.tv/criticalcomposer. Otherwise, the video on demand, is that what VOD stands for? The VOD will be available just a few hours after I turn the stream off. You can always check that out on your own time. Monday, I'll be back, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC, with the typical reactions. All right, until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.